Our next reader is a media strategist and Chicago fundamentalist. A child of the city's southeast suburbs, he's lived in Chicago proper since 1998. He lives on the south side in Morgan Park with his wife and daughter, where he hosts and produces the live lit show The Front Room, featuring stories of, by, and about the south side. Follow his further musings on Twitter at Our Man in Chicago. Please welcome back to Tuesday Funk, Scott Smith.
Hello. How's everybody back here doing? This is great. This is the first reading I've ever done where people can check out my ass.
That's what you think.
Yeah. Touche. I want to give another shout out to Martha Bain, who is not just the editor of the Chicago Neighborhood Guidebook, but is the force behind the work that Belt Publishing is doing, who is telling the unheard stories of the Midwest, who takes these idiosyncratic stories and gives them this huge amplifier that is Belt Publishing. So please,
from here.
She's just a transplant, but we'll have her. Because honestly, like, those stories are the ones that don't often get told. And please, if you have not bought a copy of the book, there's a bunch of copies for sale.
Yes.
And she's also selling copies of Rust Belt Anthology, which is another collection of really wonderful essays about the Midwest. And not just Midwest in a sort of like, well, there's Chicago, and then Belt really believes in the glory of all of the cities of the Midwest and how it's worth celebrating. So I'm so glad for Andrew and Eden to do this event tonight, because that's really what we're celebrating, is all these idiosyncratic stories. What I'm going to read tonight is a cut down version of the essay that appears in the book. So obviously, if you want to read all the words, you have to buy the book. So those words you don't know, that's a call to action. So here we go. Here's what it takes to racially integrate a Chicago neighborhood. A black real estate agent who brings black families into a white neighborhood even when someone bombs the front door of his house. A white advertising man who stands up in front of a white congregation on a Sunday morning and says things like, integration is inevitable. And a woman willing to be the only black family on her block. At least that's the way it started in Beverly, a racially integrated area of the city, roughly bound by 87th on the north, 107th Street on the south, California Avenue on the west, and Vincennes on the east. Now, according to the most recent census numbers, Beverly is 55% white and 35% black. Residents with tight-lipped Midwestern smiles forgive outsiders who believe these tree-lined streets full of historic architecture are some Oak Parkian suburb. In fact, Beverly is part of the 19th Ward on Chicago's far southwest side, one of the last strongholds of the legendary Democratic machine. It's a community that rallies and fundraises when one of its own needs help. Its strongest businesses are small and unique, from decades-old stalwarts like Top-Notch Beef Burgers, County Fair Foods, and Rainbow Cone, to newer establishments like Horse Thief Hollow Brew Pub, Belly Up Boutique, and Tranquility Salon, which, like a mullet, is a hairstyling business in the front with occasional live music in the back. The Southside Irish Parade is still a Western Avenue tradition, but so is an annual neighborhood art walk started in the last decade and featuring a multiracial coalition of artists and changemakers. Now, nearby Morgan Park had some racial integration in the first half of the 20th century. The Encyclopedia of Chicago tells us this didn't occur, quote, on a large scale until the 1960s. Meanwhile, Beverly was 99% white in 1970. By 1980, Beverly would be 15% black. But none of that change happened naturally. The years in between are when Frank Williams, Pat Stanton, and Audrey Peoples entered the picture. None of them were looking to make history, nor did they know each other at the time. Their stories are just representative of what happens when ordinary people don't act like it. Now, Frank Williams will tell you he's a fighter, but he got kicked out of high school for being a lover. In January of 1971, Frank opened a real estate agency at 90th and Ashland in Beverly. Soon after that, he began showing houses in North Beverly to black families who wanted to live there. Now, this did not endear him to some of the neighborhood associations there, and they asked him to sign a consent decree, promising not to show homes there. He refused. This was not the first time white people tried to persuade Frank to act counter to his interests. Frank was on the high school football team when he lived in segregated Flint, Michigan, and he was dating a girl named Joanne who just happened to be white. The school was not happy about it, and Joanne's parents sent her away for a time. The principal of Frank's high school sat him down and asked him to promise he would not date another white girl. Frank said he could not make that promise. For his refusal, he was kicked out of school at 18. When Joanne returned to Flint, she and Frank got married, and they moved to Chicago, where Frank became a realtor in 1966. Now, when asked if he was purposely trying to bring black families into predominantly white Beverly, Frank doesn't mince words. I always believed I and my children had a right to live and play everywhere in all communities. I was not welcomed with open arms. Now, this is Frank's way of saying the windows of 2 of his real estate offices were broken, and the front of his house was bombed too. Frank seems to consider this the price of doing business the way he wanted to do it. I've always been a fighter, and I fought, and I told these folks, no, I will not sign a consent decree that I will not solicit in Beverly. So that was that. Incidentally, Frank and Joanne have been married for 59 years now. Now, Frank doesn't have much good to say about the neighborhood associations of the time. They would do things such as integration management, integration maintenance. He describes the practice this way. The strategy was that no more than 2 or 3 so-called minorities on a block was acceptable. Once you get to that 4th person, that's the tipping point. That creates flight, that creates the exodus from the community. And just so we're clear, Frank means white flight. Now, to Frank, integration management was just another form of segregation, but to the neighborhood associations, it was smart urban planning. Which brings us to the Beverly Area Planning Association and a white guy named Pat Stanton. Now, Lawrence Pat Stanton was an advertising man. He was comfortable winning over people with a pitch. Now, the one he delivered in the summer of 1971 would change the community of Beverly for decades. A resident since 1959, Pat saw what was happening in Beverly with black families moving in, and he had a very simple view. Integration is inevitable. A member of the Human Relations Committee at Christ the King's Catholic Parish in North Beverly, Frank found himself in front of the congregation, a layperson standing at the pulpit, which was unheard of for the day, delivering a presentation off of flip charts. On July 11th and 12th, Pat would deliver this sermon, if you will, at 5 different masses, and a low-quality recording of one of his presentations was made surreptitiously by a parishioner. We call this presentation Beverly Now, and now should be underlined 3 or 4 times because now is certainly the moment for coordinated action in this community. Now, rather than stirring oratory calling upon the higher ideals of those assembled, Beverly Now is often really mundane. It's got facts and figures about housing migration and real estate prices, and Pat's words sound pragmatic, although they sound pragmatic now, and they likely sounded radical for the time. Change is beginning to affect our community, and that change will continue. There's nothing to prevent it. There are thousands of blacks who want homes. They can afford homes, and they deserve to live wherever they can afford to. Beverly Now was for realness, Pat says, on a Sunday afternoon 47 years later. It wasn't a do-gooder approach. I mean, I certainly had strong feelings about what was right, but you don't convince people because it's right. You convince them because it's practical and it's right for the community. Now, during his presentation, Pat made it pretty clear he anticipated pushback. There will be a certain percentage of people, let's hope most of them have already moved away, who won't want to live here because there are blacks in the community. He challenges the crowd. Fight the panic peddlers and the blockbusters. Let's insist that if blacks are going to look in this community, they look throughout the community. Pat explained this approach years later. The South Side changed block by block. The secret, we thought, was that you have to convince the realtors if they have black prospects to show them houses throughout the community and not to the obvious places where blacks have recently moved. Now, had Frank been in the pews that Sunday, he may have objected to this, but Pat, ever the ad man, knew his audience and how to craft a message that got them to buy. In fact, the majority of Pat's Beverly Now presentation is it's less a call for racial integration in housing and more of like a verbal white paper. It's this like holistic program of urban planning, and it includes improving the schools and supporting local businesses and promoting the area's historic architecture and talking up the local arts center. But hard-charging real estate agents, advertising men, and planning associations, they're only part of the solution. It also takes residents willing to risk being the first black face on a white block. And that's Audrey Peoples. She moved to Beverly in 1972 from what is now called Brownsville. And in Beverly, she and her husband were the only black family on her block. They would try and show us a place in Morgan Park or Washington Heights on the other side of the railroad tracks, she says. She specifically instructed the agent to show them homes from 97th to 103rd between Wood and Western, which was Beverly proper. Audrey says they moved to Beverly in May over the Memorial Day holiday. It was hot, and they had the windows open. So someone drove by and yelled the N-word, and "Get out of that house!" And then another incident, a kid from the neighborhood rode by on a bike and yelled a slur at Audrey, who was pregnant at the time. Her husband jumped in the car and drove to the kid's house to inform his mother. "Oh, I'm sure it wasn't my son," she said. It was. Most everybody in Beverly then knew where everybody else lived. Still, a white neighbor invited them to a welcome to the block party, and Audrey remembers a Protestant friend of hers saying that Audrey fit in better with the neighborhood because unlike her friend, Audrey was Catholic. Over time, she found more acceptance. Integration, after all, was inevitable, and many years later, Audrey would chuckle to herself and say her lighter skin may have helped. I've been in situations where people say, "What are you?" And then I say, "Why do you ask?" And they don't know why they ask. Once the only black girl in her Girl Scout troop, Audrey would go on to be an anti-racism trainer with the YWCA, as well as a board member with the Chicago Community Trust. Unlike some families of the 1970s, Audrey says today's North Beverly families accept integration as a given. Diversity is who they are. Beverly has, in her words, settled down. It takes dialogue and conversation. Can we have a quiet dialogue and not make people feel guilty? I bring it up at every opportunity. Now, underlying all this is this question of the tipping point and whether neighborhood associations and other folks were right to try to spread the integration throughout the community rather than expecting it to occur naturally, whatever that means. The government can try to manage it negatively through redlining. I would imagine that others can try to manage it positively. And that ultimately helps the economics of a community. Natalie Moore addresses this in her book, The South Side. And in writing about Brownsville, she says no infusion of capital and amenities followed when new black middle-class homeowners were brought into the neighborhood, therefore confirming the theory that green, as in money, doesn't trump black, as in race, end quote. She goes on to cite a 2014 Harvard University study that found economic opportunities halted once a neighborhood became 40% black. Now, by 1990, Beverly was 24% black. It's 35% now, and it often shows up on best places to live in Chicago lists. Its residents have a significantly higher average income, crime is low, especially considering some of the surrounding neighborhoods. Now, Frank, Pat, and Audrey's efforts all predated this Harvard study by about 40 years, but the questions are really the same. Is this how you keep integration from becoming segregation? And was this the right approach, and is it now? Now, whether the Beverly of the 1970s settled down in the 2010s is perhaps in the eyes and the ears of the beholder. While there may be no broken windows or porch bombs, a few times a year a racially related controversy will erupt publicly over slurs at a local bar or a ball field, or Nazi graffiti will appear overnight on a garage or a wall. And there are other racial issues that simmer beneath the surface in schools or local businesses ready to break through. Now, on the other hand, a local artist recently took discarded lawn signs from political campaigns and repainted them with messages like multiracial unity and Black Lives Matter. And people who live there will send her their address via Facebook, and under cover of night, the signs will show up on their front lawns at delivery. Sometimes they get stolen, but the artist always makes more. And a couple of weeks ago, about 200 people marched through the neighborhood, specifically in response to Nazis attempting to recruit there, and a person who was a former Nazi who was the Republican nominee for Illinois' 3rd District. So 200 people marched through 3 neighborhoods across 2 miles to push back on those recruitment efforts. As for Frank, he's still showing homes in the area and was recently given the Community Visionary Award by Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago. Pat Stanton spent the early 2000s as a columnist for The Villager, and it was expounding on the history and the present of the neighborhood. Last year, the Beverly Area Planning Association gave Pat and his wife Lorraine an award for all their years of volunteer service in the community. And Audrey still lives in the same house she moved into back in 1972. She just started her second stint on the board of the Beverly Area Planning Association. They work on neighborhood integration as well as small business support, real estate, beautification, safety concerns. So she's still in the neighborhood starting all those conversations. Depending on where you stand, literally or metaphorically, the neighborhood of Beverly can seem either of another time or slowly embracing change. But there are always a few ordinary people working on the latter. Thanks.